It's Monday, December 1st. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Today on the show, my guest is tech critic Paris Marx. We will talk about the consequences of artificial intelligence in our lives, because it feels like it's just reaching everywhere, from schools to the office and our homes. We've got some questions to ask. Yeah, it's one of those things when it comes to life. Every so often, something is all of a sudden everywhere, and you're like, "How did this happen? When did this happen?" And we're at the point where, here's a recent headline: NL asks Deloitte to carry out review after incorrect, I'm using my quotation fingers there, citations found in $1.6 million provincial health plan. Comes on heels of Education Accord having false citations. And just to briefly read the lead, or the first couple graphs there, the Newfoundland and Labrador government says it's been in contact with the private company responsible for a new report meant to guide the province into the future, which was found to contain fake citations and cost over $1 million. Online newspaper The Independent reported that the province's Department of Health recently released a human resource plan conducted by consulting firm Deloitte, which contains 4 fake citations. The situation comes months after the province's Education Accord was called into question after Radio-Canada reported it contained at least 15 citations for non-existent journal articles and document. And then in a statement, the Department of Health communications officer, Brian Scott, said Deloitte has been in contact and asked to confirm the accuracy of the report's citations and literature review. So this was Elizabeth Whitten, my colleague, wrote this November 24th. Point being, a couple of reports, questions around AI, and I just feel, Paris, I don't know, I know you're in this because you're a tech critic, but I just feel there's just so much kind of swirling around from these reports as our jumping off point to thinking about data centers, to looking at even for journalism and new rules and regulations and all of that kind of a thing. AI feels like it's everywhere.
Absolutely, because it is, right? But it's even wild to me, as you say, right? I'm a tech critic. I comment a lot on things happening in the United States. I do a lot of work in Europe. I pay attention to what's going on in Canada. But it's not often that the story is right in front of you happening in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's these reports, when the education report was found to have had these AI-generated citations, I didn't find out about it from local news. I found out about it reading, in international publications in the States and stuff. And I was like, wait, what is going on? And then, of course, to see the Deloitte one as well, it's unfortunately, our province has become one of the focal points for where these things are playing out. And where, part of the story is really evolving, in an unfortunate way, I feel like.
Yeah, with the Education Accord, the question, what happened? They're still trying to look around. They're looking to see, okay, was it indeed AI? What's happening with this? But then, the Deloitte one, and then just, I don't know, everything. If I go to Google now or whatever, it's going to give me the AI summary, whether that's right or wrong. I tested it back in the summer. I was, curious about something, and I think I mentioned this on the show before. I was thinking, gardening. I'm I do gardening once a week. What's here's a test, right? What are the tips it's going to give me? Yeah. A couple of tips were great, and then one of the tips said well, be careful in your gardens in Newfoundland about deer coming into them, and I was like, oh dear, right? Come on. And so just even those little things of thought and the fact that it's everywhere. Let's start with, what are a couple important questions people should be asking themselves when it comes to where we're everything that's swirling around right now?
Yeah, you go many different directions with it, right? I would think, if you're thinking about actually using these tools, what that actually looks like, I don't use them personally, but what is this tool actually doing, right? How does it actually work? What is actually coming out of this thing? Can I trust it, right? I think the companies are very engaged in, trying to present these tools as trustworthy, as useful, as things that we should be relying on and should be adopting in, our day-to-day lives, our work lives, whatever it is that we're doing. But, as you're saying, there's still a lot of inaccuracies that come from these tools, whether it is just, engaging with a Google AI overview summary, or finding it in work reports and it's generating things that are false, that are incorrect, because I feel like the companies are trying to make us believe that these tools act in a way that they don't, right? It's not like a computer that is thinking, that is coming up with something. It's a predictive model that's trying to predict what should be generated based on the prompt that it's given, and that means that it's not. It doesn't understand the issue. It's just looking at this massive corpus of data that it has and trying to figure out what the right words to present after that are going to actually be, right? And that can lead to false information in many cases.
Yeah, so then let's keep going with that because people keep hearing about generative AI these days. So then you keep going with the explanation around what exactly it is.
Sure. Like AI is everywhere, right? Yeah. Like, let's be clear about that. If we're thinking about, the broader term that is used, like, if you're typing something into your phone and you get a word wrong and it suggests using a different spelling or fixing the word or whatnot, that technically is AI, right? But it's something very different than, say, a ChatGPT or one of these chatbots or an image generator or something like that, right? These other forms of AI or machine learning that we're thinking about in the past, they're not really creating things from scratch, right? They're working with what's already there. They might be reformatting it, presenting it in a different way, organizing it differently, whatever, right? But with generative AI, you basically have these massive models, the way that the companies are creating them, the ones that the companies are selling to us and trying to get us to use, that require massive amounts of data. So they basically go out and they try to get as much data as they can off of the open web and off of other kind of databases and things like that. People have probably heard the stories about them using movies and books and, journalism that they don't have the permission to use.
Newspapers, yeah.
Exactly, right? And so they're pulling all that in. They're also using massive amounts of computation then to train a model that is kind of forming the basis of these tools that you then interact with, when you're putting a prompt into ChatGPT or you're seeing an overview come up on Google. And that requires a lot of computation. And so that's part of the reason why you're also hearing a lot of the talk about data centers now, whether it is in the province or in other parts of the world, or the environmental impacts that come along with it. We're hearing about in the news more and more. And obviously all of that takes a lot of money. And maybe the one piece that the companies don't like to talk a lot about is how they're still losing a lot of money on these tools, and it's not clear they're going to be profitable.
So then if I'm sitting at home in any community in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'm thinking about AI. So like we just said, it needs like oceans of data, which is why also some folks have been trained to like chat with AI and stuff to help with the conversing and to get that trained up, plus all the other info that's been put into it. But then like the computing power, you need so much, which is why you hear about these data centers being built, and then also seeing like, okay, should we get in on this action? Should we build a data center? And like, I remember way back, years, like the black and white pictures of like the first big supercomputers.
Yeah.
But now, okay, so like let's say, so folks, look in your living room. Imagine that's a big supercomputer from the thing you might remember in a black and white picture. Now, Paris, tell me how big a data center is.
Oh my God. It's like, if you imagine football fields and football fields of size, right? Like, we're just going through like the Black Friday sales. We're hearing about all of that. If you're buying things online, you know that the goods you're purchasing are coming from a massive warehouse, right? If you're buying something from Amazon, for example, it has these really large warehouses filled with all of the goods that you might possibly buy, off of the website or whatnot, and then it gets kind of fulfilled out to you once you buy something, right? Well, a data center, think about something rather similar, right? It's a massive warehouse. The scale just keeps getting larger and larger every year. And, if you think about kind of running your computer, if you're doing a lot on it, you might notice it get hot. You might notice the fans going if your computer still has a fan in it. A lot of them don't these days, especially the ones regular people would be using. But, you've probably felt it getting hot, right? And so imagine this kind of facility that actually has tens or hundreds of thousands of servers or graphics processing units, graphics cards, which are what is used for a lot of the AI stuff that's happening now.
All those pictures of people with 6 fingers, right?
Exactly, yeah. Which again, run hotter, require even more energy to run them, things like that. Obviously more cooling than if they're running really hot. But, you have a facility filled with tens or hundreds of thousands of servers and whatnot that are making all these things run. And the companies behind this, especially Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, which are the major kind of companies that control what we call the cloud, right? A lot of this computation, a lot of these major data centers, they have been on basically a building spree for the past few years, which, is leading a lot of analysts now to say, I think we might be building out a bit too much here. The people are getting worried. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and then when you have these big data centers, with the amount of electricity it needs. So then the question, and to touch briefly on climate, we can go into it again later. But so when you think of like these giant data centers and these big warehouses that are being built, have been built, are being built all over, how do you power them? And so what's the electricity grid, right? Is it hydro? Is it burning coal? Is it nuclear? Is it renewables? Well, I mean, hydrogen with that too, but when I say that, I mean solar or wind. So you have these questions with all of the energy that it needs. And if we keep building up and out too much, it's not all green energy going into these things.
Certainly not. The companies would like us to believe that, certainly, right? And when you hear them talk about the energy use that goes into these facilities, they will talk a lot about the investments in renewable that they're making, or the investments in nuclear energy, which is what we've been hearing a lot about the past few years. But if you actually look into it, because they are building so many so fast, and a lot of these are in the United States, but also in many other parts of the world as well, but about half or more of these major data centers, hyperscale data centers is what we call them, these really large ones, are in the United States. And what we're seeing there is, sure, they're building out more renewable energy and all these sorts of things, even as the Trump administration is, kind of pulling incentives and things to try to build renewable energy. But actually, what we're seeing more tangibly is a lot of investment in more fossil fuels, a lot of the kind of extension of life on existing fossil fuel plants that we're supposed to be shutting down, and that a lot of that is natural gas, so you're seeing a lot more natural gas being used. But part of that is also coming from coal, which we know is obviously a lot more emissions intensive than even natural gas, which itself is not great. But that's contributing a lot more to climate change, to increasing emissions. And when we look at the companies, the Googles and Microsofts of the world in particular, Amazon has been less active on the climate front, I would say. But they made pledges a few years ago that they were going to get to carbon neutral or carbon negative by 2030. And what we're kind of seeing is that they are way off on those goals because they have pursued generative AI and this massive data center build out. And that's very resource intensive, very energy intensive, and a lot of that energy is coming from fossil fuels.
So then if you're hearing folks here talk about it, looking at, for example, parts of Labrador, and saying, well, why don't we get in on this action? If it's being built up, built out, if some of the future if we're in an AI, leading to an AI future, in an AI present, why not try to capitalize off of this?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And I think it is something
super fascinating.
Totally. And I think it's something we need to be talking about because there are obviously a lot of interest groups that are pushing this, right? Like I remember when, what was that, probably a year or two ago, when the kind of wind hydrogen project out near Stephenville, there was talk of potentially data centers being involved in what was going on out there. And, we see it with other projects around the province as well, just on the island, let alone what's happening in Labrador. But now, of course, as the discussions around the future of hydro, the future of Gull Island and all that stuff are, kind of opened up a little bit more again. There are obviously groups talking about whether data centers should be part of that discussion as well, which to me feels, wrong for many reasons. But, if you're thinking about setting up data centers in Labrador, right, what are the types of things that you need for that? Obviously, you need the power, the electricity. Labrador has the benefit of, for much of the year, having colder temperatures. So if you're looking to cool that down, you can use kind of outdoor air for part of the year. We see that in more northern climates. But obviously, you need a certain amount of infrastructure for these facilities as well, right? So you need really good internet connections, which is not something that we obviously associate with Labrador, unfortunately. Should be better. I would like to see the government investing a lot more in better internet for people up in Labrador, but that is something that would need to be significantly improved for that to be, more of, something worth considering, I guess. The government would also likely have to offer significant incentives to data center companies to set up there, tax incentives and things like that, which, I don't know, they probably are open to contemplating. But the other big piece is like, yes, there have been a lot of big data centers built out over the past number of years, but if you listen to analysts right now, the Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank and, a lot of these big people who are looking at the investment opportunities and whether they're going to lose money on all this stuff, they're saying like, I think that there's too many data centers being built out right now. It's not clear where the money is coming from for all of this. And a lot of people are worried that there's going to be a crash and then you're going to have a lot of data centers that don't have, are not going to be useful for a while because there have been too many built out, right?
Yeah. So then you end up with abandoned places that are just that have been built or half built and just there.
Totally. And, unfortunately, we're a province with quite a history of boondoggles, I think it's fair to say, going in on big projects that don't work out.
Yeah. I mean, I think it wouldn't take much to look through the past to see some things that have not worked out too well for folks in Newfoundland and Labrador. We have, so folks, Paris Marx is here, tech critic. We're talking about AI, artificial intelligence today. And it's a conversation that's going from some local stuff that's happening, right? With reports and issues, looking at possibilities for some of like what's happening in the world as AI gets developed. And in this case, we were just talking about the potential for data centers in Labrador. We've got more to the conversation. We've got a couple of calls planned as well, because when we were kind of curating the conversation for today, I was like, okay, I wouldn't mind having to dip slightly into that political side of things. And also I've got an education question coming up too from a guest who was on just last week, who will be on shortly again. But as you're listening to us, if there's something you want to know, right, because there's so many questions, and if you want to get in on the action on asking them, send us an email, thesignal@cbc.ca, or text us 709-327-8206, and I'll toss the questions into the queue. For now, we have NDP leader Jim Dinn on the line. Hello, sir. How you doing?
Not too bad, sir, on this gray, foggy day.
Yes, I'm waiting for the rain to start. Wondering if I can get a run in this evening or not in the dark. But we shall see. I'm sure I could ask AI to give me an answer on it.
That's
see
right.
how accurate it is.
So yeah, it'll be careful for deer. Mr. Dinn, I got in touch with you because a release came out the other day. NDP calls for regulations around government AI use. Can you just expand a bit on your party's thoughts on that and where you would like to see things go?
I think, from my point of view, AI is like anything else. It's a tool, and it's how it's used that's going to be important. And I guess I come at it from an education point of view as well. I mean, in the classroom, when the internet was sort of really exploding and it was easy to get information and so on and so forth, it came down to even within the school, how to ensure that the work that the student was being passed into was actually the work of that student and not something that lifted from or plagiarized and so on and so forth. So we've got two, and in this world, I guess currently or recently, we've had two reports where it seemed that the reports have gotten out, and that there are in health and in education where there was some question about the references that were used, whether they actually existed or they were used improperly or they weren't relevant to the topic. So obviously there's a few things at play here. If government is going to be making developing reports that are going to impact the people of the province, the workers who deliver those services and so on and so forth, then it's incumbent upon us to make sure that they are accurately reflecting the needs of the province, the demands, the unique circumstances of the province, and so on and so forth. And you do need to have, I think, at the ground there, the human element, because especially from a government point of view, you're delivering service to the people. You're addressing needs in the province. And to your your comment there about be careful there, to the point is that it's funny but not funny. Because
yes, yeah.
It's obviously not. It's making I guess or statements that are not really reflective of what the situation is in Newfoundland and Labrador. And maybe you can extrapolate that to when you're looking at when it comes to healthcare. I look at the Lloyd Touche report. First of all, you're paying an awful lot of money to an organization, a consulting firm, to to make sure that to do this report and to inform the decision making, only to find out that they used AI, which brings me back to the question, well, you probably could have done that. We probably could have done that ourselves. But apart from that, then is who is doing the final check to make sure that that what's in there is accurately reflective of the needs. The other part of it is, does this mean then that a government might say, as we have the current government talking about finding inefficiencies and saving and cutting government waste? Well, what does that mean? Does that mean then that we're going to be using that they're going to be using more AI to write reports, and therefore you don't need as many people? Are you going to have people who are trying to be working on some of this and verifying the information in a document, I guess, out the corner of their desk? So I think it comes down to having regulations as to how it's used, where it's used, if and when, if at times when it should not be used. What's the role then of frontline workers and the unions that represent those frontline workers in providing input? So it's a tool, I guess. I look at it like anything else. I look at it from my teaching days. Like using the internet technology was fantastic in augmenting. If I was doing a segment or a lesson on some particular issue, you could readily identify examples from the internet that could be used in the class. It could enrich it, but I wouldn't rely on it to do the work, my work as such. So I guess there's got to be that human element, if that makes sense.
100%, sir. I appreciate your time. I'm going to put everything back to Paris Marx here to get some thoughts on it as well. But I thank you so much for coming back on the program.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Right. So the leader of the NDP there just saying, we need some rules and regs around this. I think you might be in agreement to this, Paris. I'm not sure.
Yeah, definitely agree with my MHA there. I think there's a lot there that I agree with, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the key things I'd like to highlight is that human element, right? I think that can often be kind of lost, right? Especially when we talk about more broadly the effort to push AI into whether it's creative fields, whether it's writing and journalism, whether it's, government as well, right? I think that one of the things we're seeing certainly on the provincial level, but I would say more prominently on the national level.
Well, PM's big on talking about this.
Exactly, right? Yeah. Is trying to push AI into so many different facets of government. Again, as Mr. Dim was saying, to try to, make the delivery of services more efficient. What does that actually mean in practice, right? We have actually seen, even before generative AI, a lot of examples of governments around the world trying to roll out AI tools to make the delivery of services supposedly more efficient, whether it's in welfare systems, whether it's in immigration and visa processing, whether it's in healthcare. And in many cases, that has actually had negative impacts on the people who are trying to access those services, right? Discriminatory impacts, people being cut off of benefits who should have had, who should have had access to them, which cause a lot of harm in those people's lives. And so, it's not clear to me that we're paying enough attention to that element of it right now as we're talking about cost savings and how AI might be able to deliver that, when it's still, I would say, really not clear that is something that it can do. But I also think that there's a bigger point that was coming up in what was being said there, which is that we have these two reports, right, where we're questioning how much AI was actually used in writing them and putting them together. And certainly, we focused on the citations. It's clear that to a certain degree, they have been used to put citations together. If that's the extent of it, I don't think that's really harming many people, right?
Yeah, if it's a formatting citations thing, you're like, okay, well, let's just have a little conversation around this.
Exactly. And I'm not that worried about citations being wrong. Like, obviously we want the proper things backing up what is being proposed, and but if it's just there were some incorrect things put in citations, that shouldn't necessarily call into question what is in a broader report. But I feel like the bigger question, which was really coming up in what Mr. Dim was saying, was that I think over the past few decades, we have already moved in a direction where the capacities of government to govern, right, and to actually be able to make proposals and understand what should be done on key issues that affect, the broader population has been eroded because of cost cutting, because of, gutting certain departments. And that has led them to rely more on consultants in order to, put together these reports to tell us what we should be doing and how we should be governing and all these sorts of things. And, this is not just an issue in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's an issue on the federal level. People will probably have noticed there's been a lot of discussion in the past number of years about the amount of money being spent on consultants by the federal government. It's also an issue beyond Canada as well. There's a lot of governments talking about this over-reliance on consultants, whether it's McKinsey or Deloitte or KPMG or, these companies whose whole business model is, basically to get really fat contracts doing these reports for governments and big companies and things like that, right? And now if we're moving into this era where, the capacity of government has already been reduced in this way, and now we're talking about cutting it down even further by the use of AI, at the same time as these consulting companies are also looking at the opportunities to use AI to put together more of these reports so it's less costly for them as well, and they can make greater profits doing this stuff. It's like, where are we actually going? Are we actually being able to address, the core issues in our societies? Like, Mr. Din was talking about how the AI might not be reflecting the intricacies and specific context of Newfoundland and Labrador. I would say that's also already the case with the consulting firms that we're hiring to put together these reports, right? That often aren't rooted in the communities in this place to actually understand what's going on here. So I think it's like AI is like the most recent development in a much broader issue that we've been trying to deal with, or that has been developing for a long time.
Yeah, which is why I think it's so important to have these types of discussions, right? Of just being like, hey, what's happening? What's the potential? Where are things going? What should we be looking at? Should we be asking questions around legislation, regulation, all of these things? What are the impacts, right? It's one thing for me to be in my doctor's office and for something to be taking notes as I talk to my doctor, but the doctor making the decisions. But as to your point, the bigger questions are, if you have AI that's making decisions that people used to make when it comes to benefits, I've got some big questions around that.
Exactly. And even in the case of the doctor example that you're giving, right? If you're using generative AI for that transcription, is it transcribing accurately, or is it inserting things that were not actually said, and that when the doctor reviews it later, is going to give a different idea of what the conversation between you and your doctor was, right? And we have seen tangible examples of that. So it's like, are you just using a regular transcription tool, which might make some errors, but is transcribing what's there? Or are you using a generative AI tool that is going to insert things that maybe were never said in the first place, right?
Yeah, I was listening to Peter Mansbridge's podcast yesterday, and Chantal Hébert was on, and Mansbridge just said, he's like, actually, when the subtitles for it that automatically get made, it had Chantal A, then BEAR, Hébert. And it's just, but anyways, as a point of where things can sometimes go in a funny way. Mon history prof, Sean Cadigan, is on the line. Hello, sir.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Thanks for coming back. This is what happens. You come on, you do a whole show with me, and then we have a side conversation, and then I pull you back in for 5 extra minutes. But you were in last week here in the studio, and then we were, I can't remember if it was before or after the show. It doesn't matter. We were having a chat about, because I said, I'm doing this thing on AI coming up. And you had thoughts, because you're doing stuff with students, and just tell me just kind of from your university professor lens with your students, kind of what's been creeping in, what the worries are, and what you folks are trying to do about it.
Right. Well, increasingly, at least some of us see our students turning to generative AI, and they're often prohibited by the nature of the course that they're taking to do so. But they're using it to produce their assignments. And what we see when that happens is that the assignments often look really nice. They're really well structured, but they're otherwise completely fabricated. And I had a case last year involving one such utter fabrication. I was really quite struck by it and worried about how a student could get themselves in so much trouble so fast. And so I started looking at the commonly available generative AIs and how they might be used by students, and it wasn't good. So I thought we weren't really achieving very much by just trying to ban it. I think, you rarely have much success with young people when you just say to them, you just can't use this or you just can't do it because I say so. So I designed an assignment in a course this year, a series of assignments for this semester around having students actually working with generative AI and then contrasting the results of what they got with generative AI with doing the same thing in a library with real sources and real people who they could engage with in developing the project that was assigned.
And how were the learning lessons? Did anyone use AI for both of these things, or did they actually follow through and do the project?
So the first two assignments that they did involved generative AI. One I specified. The second I gave them a choice of another type, just so that they could get some sense of how different types of things are available. And these are commonly available ones that everybody sort of uses all the time. And in one case, it comes up automatically almost automatically when you do Google searches. So they use that material, and they found I think they all started to realize that you get a surprising amount of what people sometimes, when they're referring to AI, call hallucinations or the fake citations and fake material. Sometimes a completely made-up topic, a phenomenon that they're trying to study, and they suggest, for example, that perhaps a strike existed that never happened or something along those lines. And I think what the students sort of learned from that, or at least they all indicated, is that first, there's a tremendous reliability problem with almost all the generative AI they have access to. That leads to a big problem for them personally because it means they can be accused of things like academic misconduct. And that in order to try to make anything that they got from generative AI useful, they had to engage in far more work than if they just went and did it themselves using our regular library and university resources.
Right.
So in other words, it wasted time. It produced inaccurate results and unreliable results. And further, many of our students noticed that over time, so there were 32 students in this class, all working on a similar topic. Over time, depending on when you tried to do this assignment, you got vastly different results.
Right.
And so I think what was happening was at least some of the generative AI was actually learning from their queries. And so if you started early, you got much less reliable stuff. If you were later in the game, you might get more reliable stuff. But everybody converged. That is to say, regardless of the 32 queries, everybody came out sounding the same. And that shouldn't happen in higher level learning.
No.
Right, in which the students' own perspectives, creativity, and so on should really play an important part in how they're learning and how they're interpreting. And that seemed to get almost ironed out of the process altogether.
Wow. This is great, and I want to stay on this with you. I'll be in touch with you later for future ideas around this topic, and maybe even with some students, because I find it fascinating.
Right. Well, all I can say is that at the end, it was a very depressing experience, I think, for students because it was kind of stressful to see what problems you could get into with generative AI. In a way, I found it really stressful to have put the students through it. So I'm not sure that I would do it again anytime soon, but I think it was a very useful sort of exercise.
Some lessons involve stress, and you're better for it at the end, even though it's really hard to get through it. Professor Sean Cadigan, thanks as always.
Thank you.
Cheers. All right, Paris, any thought? Oh, and this ties into a note from a caller we got. How accurate is AI? So I think a lot of this conversation has just informed that question, but we can go a little bit further on it. And folks, if you've got AI-related, artificial intelligence-related questions, the signal at cbc.ca. Text us, 709-327-8206. Tech critic Paris Marx is with me up until for another, 20-odd minutes. Thoughts about Professor Cadigan and the assignment there with the students?
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, I thought it was really great.
Totally. Like one of the things that I often say, right, is I think that people need to understand the technologies that we're using, right, how they actually work. And, I think that the companies are often very incentivized to mislead us on how the technologies work, right? So we overestimate what they can do. And, I think sometimes media reporting can also tend to do that, repeating some of the things that the companies are saying and whatnot. And so, we're kind of getting the narrative of the companies and, the notion that they're very reliable, that we should be using them in all these ways, that they're going to transform the world in so many different ways and what have you, right? And so I find this really fascinating because like obviously there's the question, and the professor said he might not repeat the assignment, but of what you're not teaching or what you're not doing because you need to engage with the technology and try to learn it. But at the same time, it's like it feels to me like a really good exercise in actually helping students understand this technology that is not just pervasive and all around them, but that the companies are actually explicitly trying to push on students, right? Because they understand that getting these tools into education is a great way to be getting people using them early, getting people used to using them, and so they'll become dependent on them later, right? And we actually see that in the user numbers, for example, for ChatGPT, where often when the school year ends, you see a notable dip in the amount of usage until September comes around again, and then it picks back up, right? Because they're explicitly targeting it toward students. So yeah, I think really fascinating. I think a great way to understand how the tools actually work, what they're actually doing. Again, as the questioner asked, how reliable they actually are. How much useful information you're getting from it. And I would say on the question of reliability, it sort of depends on the tool, right? I would say there's still a rather high degree of the risk of, hallucinations, to use that term, not a term I love, but, basically the tools spitting out false information that, you might not recognize is incorrect, if you're just engaging with it. And especially as the companies have been trying to make smaller and more efficient models, right? Ones that are less resource intensive, less computationally intensive, those ones have even higher significantly higher amounts of kind of false information that you're getting from it because they're trying to do it with less. And so we've actually seen, there were developments recently that as ChatGPT was putting out newer models, they were actually less reliable than the models that had existed before, right?
Right. I was thinking of at this point in time, if I look at some promises made a few years ago, trucks were supposed to be driving themselves, cars were supposed to be driving themselves, 5G was supposed to do so much. Like, I was so excited about when I heard about 5G, and then I was like, oh, what are we? And then I'm like, oh, nothing's changed at all.
Yeah, you get to download things a bit faster.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes. I can have my binge watching Saturdays with fewer disruptions. So there's that. Now, not to say that is happening again right now, obviously with AI, but my question is it happening again right now with AI? Like, what's your, like, as a tech critic, someone who follows this, someone who's writing on this all the time, someone who contributes to Wired and Time, speaks internationally, like, is this overhyped by companies?
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah,
I knew this answer before you're going to give me.
Yeah, and obviously, this is my view on these I'm a critic, right? And I think that these companies are always engaged in overhyping, overselling what they're doing, because that is how you get a much higher valuation for your company, how you attract a lot more investment, right? And we see this continually with kind of the cycles in the tech industry, right? 5 years ago, cryptocurrency was going to completely change the banking system and all this kind of stuff. And I don't think
it hasn't.
Yeah,
all those promises.
I was actually in the Avalon Mall the other day and saw the Bitcoin ATM that's there with a big sign over top of it warning people they're probably getting scammed if they're using it. This is basically what cryptocurrency is in our society, right? But we were all going to live in the metaverse a few years ago as well. If you listen to Mark Zuckerberg, and continually they want to overhype the products that they're putting out into the world to make us believe that they're going to have a bigger impact than they're actually having. And I think it's interesting that you bring up the self-driving cars and stuff, because for me, one of the things that really, was an important step in changing the way that I saw the tech companies and Silicon Valley and these technologies and whatnot was actually the 2010s, right? And, going into the 2010s, there was a lot of discussion about how new forms of AI and robotics were going to wipe out a ton of jobs. They were saying up to half of jobs were going to get eliminated or replaced by robots. People might remember that there was like a political discussion in the mid to late 2010s about whether we would need a universal basic income, so give people just a certain amount of money every month because there were going to be so many people out of work because of these new technologies.
Yeah, with the universal basic income with UBI, and we lead lives of leisure as the machines do everything.
Exactly.
It has yet to happen.
Yeah, and people might have noticed that didn't happen, right? But for me, kind of coming into that decade, I was like, oh wow, everything is changing. Like, how are we going to respond to it? And then as we went through the decade, I was like, wait, all these things that the company said were supposed to be happening are not happening. And actually, if you looked at the statistics, productivity growth, you would assume that if there's so much more technology being added to the economy, productivity is going to like spike as a result of that. Productivity growth in the United States in the 2010s was like the lowest in decades, right? So you would assume it would be the opposite if this big kind of transformation was happening. As we hear it a lot from Mark Carney today that we need to be embracing AI because we need to improve productivity in the Canadian economy. I'm really not sold on that actually making a big difference. And so, by the time we get to the end of the 2010s, we don't have this mass kind of, eradication of work as the companies suggested. But what we do have is companies, especially tech companies, starting with them, rolling out technologies to get more power over the workers that are under the managers, right? To basically empower the managers even more. So, an Amazon warehouse, for example, employs algorithmic management so that the workers are kept to this really high rate of production. And it also ensures that the companies easily bust unions when the workers try to unionize, make sure that people working in logistics at Amazon warehouses make a lot less than if they were working at, say, other logistics companies. Logistics warehousing, traditionally unionized industry, you make a good job doing that.
Yeah.
Same with like delivery and stuff. If you're doing it for Amazon, you make a lot less than if you were doing it for other companies because they try
Amazon's
to make
not hurting for a buck.
Exactly. But this is how they make a lot of that money, right? By making sure that workers can't. Or you think of like Uber, for example, which is now legal here, which we're allowing to operate here. They kind of built a labor model that was based around ensuring these workers are contractors. They have very little control over their work. And through the pandemic, Uber rolled out new forms of, again, algorithmic management, new forms of algorithmic control that try to make sure that they are going to maximize the amount of money the customer will pay for a ride and minimize the amount that the driver is going to receive, and actually obscured it to make it much more difficult for the driver to understand, how much money, what percentage they're getting, how much money the customer is paying, all those sorts of things, right? So it's like using technology in this way to increase their power and to make us kind of pay more, to reduce the power that we have over, these companies, our employers, all these sorts of things. And so that was what really kind of shifted it for me about what these companies were doing, was like, oh, technology is not like this. Technology can be used for good, right? Like there's no question about it. But the way that these companies have been set up and the way that they deploy and develop technology is in a way to serve their own interests, I would say, often at the expense of, so many of the rest of us. And we see that, more clearly than ever with the kind of alliance of tech billionaires that has formed around Donald Trump over the past, year or so, and how it's very clear that they are just engaged in preserving their power, over anything else, right? And so I think that this is something that like can't be ignored when we look at generative AI as well, especially when we look at the fact that the tools don't perform as well as the companies want us to believe, that we have a number of stories in the United States and Canada that companies rolling out generative AI tools. Just, I believe it was last week, there was a story in the Globe and Mail saying that only 2% of Canadian companies that have rolled out generative AI have actually made a return on investment, which is not really playing well for what Mark Carney is telling us, we need to do to transform the economy. So I think that there are a lot of red flags here on the economic side, but also just like seeing the broader social effects of the way that these technologies have rolled out too.
So is there a future for us in Canada that doesn't involve like a Bezos or a Musk or the folks who, well, two of them did have great seats, but the other folks who had the great seats next to the inauguration, the Silicon Valley crowd? Can we have a future where we use this as a tool for our benefit that helps Canadians, Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and everyone else? Like, are the choices there for us?
I think so, definitely, right? I think that we made a mistake in the 1990s. This is when the internet was privatized, when we really started to digitize a lot of things, in basically accepting that technology had to be something largely left to the private sector, that it had to be developed by these major companies for profit, and that there was no role for public tech development or nonprofit tech development.
Because the internet was not developed by a company.
Totally.
Right? I know this from you, from a previous show we did.
Yeah, it was developed by universities and by the military, basically, right? Military funding into universities. But what happened in that moment is when the internet was privatized, it was like, all of these companies are getting a ton of investment in the dot-com boom in the late 90s into the early 2000s, and that really kind of set the model, right? All these, especially as we move a bit later, all these countries want to have big tech companies of their own because it will deliver kind of, returns, whether it's tax revenue or jobs and all that kind of stuff. And so, we can't think about technology for the public good. It's like whatever these companies develop is what we'll adopt. And of course, what we see, say, in the provincial government or something is increasingly, instead of developing tools that might work for government or for public services or whatnot, we contract in, some kind of private tool, or, maybe there's a local company or Canadian company that's building something. We buy that to try to encourage them, to try to give them a start or something like that. That might not work, the best for what we need. Obviously, technology has been a real way for I would say privatization to increasingly work its way into our healthcare system, right? You can access private doctors operating in a different province through an app, if you want to get around, kind of the difficulties in accessing public healthcare, right? And that all contributes to an erosion, I would argue, in the quality of the healthcare that we receive. It's actually kind of ironic that one of the leaders in the big health tech push is TELUS, which used to be a public telecom operator and was privatized. But I guess basically what I would say is that, if we're thinking about a different way to do this, I would say, obviously we can have private companies developing technology and all that kind of stuff, but why can't we have, in the way that we have a CBC, in the way that we have a public postal service like Canada Post, the way that we have public libraries, why can't we think about setting up like a crown corporation or an agency that actually has resources and a mandate to develop technology for the public good, to help the government operate instead of the government running on Microsoft products, to help our schools, have a platform that it can use instead of them all being on Google Classroom. There are so many ways where our dependence on these technologies actually makes no sense when you really start to think about it. And I would say it's not properly aligned with the goals that we might have for public services and government. And there's a real opportunity to start to change those things to begin to wean ourselves off of these technologies and these billionaires. I don't think, there's any chance of us, unfortunately, getting off of this stuff overnight. But there are, I would say, a lot of kind of like low-hanging fruit opportunities that we could look at to begin to transform, kind of the tech system that we use at the moment, right?
Are there any whiffs of this from our AI minister, Evan Solomon, so far?
I would say no. Evan Solomon, and we hear this from him, but also from Mark Carney. They are very engaged in trying to promote, a private tech industry in Canada, right? Whether that is Canadian companies, but also U.S. companies investing more in Canada. They're completely open to these things because they see technology through the lens of investment, right? Part of the reason I would argue Mark Carney has been talking so much about AI is because for the past few years, there's been so much money put into generative AI, artificial intelligence, data centers, and they want a piece of that money, even if this is a short-term thing that in a year or two is gonna collapse, and then there'll be a new thing that kind of replaces it, right? Like, to me, I think it's a really short-sighted, kind of policy mechanism or pursuit that they're on. But if we're thinking about like regulations and things like that too, of course, Evan Solomon has sidelined the AI regulations that the Trudeau government was working on. And, there were flaws with those and there's opportunity to improve it. But now when he does interviews, the only thing he really talks about is privacy, privacy concerns about AI, and also deepfakes, kind of creating photos or videos of people that they haven't, that they're not okay with, basically, right? That they haven't agreed to. But I would say it goes far beyond that, right? The concerns about the impacts that generative AI are having, whether it's, the professor talking about the impact on students. We've seen a number of studies now suggesting people who are using generative AI regularly, it has kind of effects on critical thinking skills, on your ability to retain information that you are engaging with, which is, kind of warning flags, I would say, especially with when you're thinking about students, but I would say more broadly than that, as well. Obviously, we're having a growing number of stories about the mental health impacts of, a dependence on these chatbots, especially at a time when the companies are focusing even more on rolling out what they call like AI companions and things like that to try to get you more engaged with the product. But we have seen a number of people be institutionalized, have mental health breaks because of the dependence on these products. Even
it's
trying
so weird
to take
just
their
to
lives,
be.
right?
It makes it feel like we're all guinea pigs as companies are trying to profit from the way you're laying it out. Like that's just the observation of, because it's like, oh, we've got this new chatbot who's going to be your friend. Okay, how does that impact people?
Totally. A friend of mine at the Washington Post has kind of described this as like speed running the problems with social media, right? It's like I feel like we're kind of broadly having this discussion now about, whether young people should be using social media as much. We've banned phones from schools and things like that. Whether we should be regulating social media even more. Of course, again, the previous government had, I believe it was called the Online Safety Bill, which it was moving forward, again, to try to rein into some of these problems with social media, but other online platforms as well, and that was sidelined by the government. The most recent reporting is there might be a new version of it sometime in the new year, but again, we don't know what is going to be in there, right? And so chatbots are like, okay, it's taken us a couple decades to get to this point where we're like, okay, social media, sure, it's been great in connecting us. There are benefits to it, but there are also a lot of drawbacks that maybe we should be trying to address. Chatbots within a few years, we're already at this place where we're seeing social harm. It feels like our governments don't really want to talk about the social harm because that would mean it would potentially question the investment, that is coming from this. Of course, Mark Carney was recently over in the Middle East in the UAE, where he signed, this big agreement on AI investment in Canada from the United Arab Emirates, even as there are questions about the UAE contributing to a genocide in Sudan, right? And it's like, what are we doing here? It's wild to me.
Yeah, and it's just so much to keep track of.
Yeah,
and to think about. So, like, as we, it's a couple of minutes left, but like, where the look aheads for you right now, and some other things that I know you're working on a book. Just what are some of the things that you're kind of looking into the near or a little bit further into the future?
Yeah, so I would say one question is, what actually happens with AI and the investment in AI? Is this going to collapse? Is this a big bubble, as some people are suggesting, a financial bubble where the valuations of these companies are really inflated and that is going to burst at some point? What does that mean for data centers, of course, especially as this discussion becomes something that we're having in this province as well around the future of hydro, whether this should be part of the economic development model, or whether there are a lot of, jurisdictions kind of putting a lot of resources or energy behind something that is ultimately not going to pay off. It looks like, down in the United States, again, where more of these hyperscale data centers have been built so far, that they are contributing to a significant increase in power bills in many different parts of the country. And it looks like that's gearing up to be a big midterm election issue as we go into 2026. So again, like there's a big kind of political dimension to all of this. And yeah, it's going to keep playing out. It's not going anywhere.
No. One extra text. Let me see. When the compilers of any meaningful report fail to check and read, in all caps, the citations upon which they rely, what else have they missed or misconstrued? Great question. Lawyers have been caught in court with fake AI authorities, which destroy their credibility. Why should the big consultants be treated differently? That's from David Morris, listener of the show, sends in notes from fairly frequently, which I always appreciate, David. And yeah, great questions there as we wind down here of like, what else can be misconstrued? So this is going back to even the start of the show today of us talking about the two questions around two local reports around citations, and questions around whether or not AI was used within them, and this world that we're living in of like, okay, double, triple checking your work, students and fake papers and just what this has given them, the impacts this can have on the students and people, plus the impacts of climate change and powering data centers, and whether or not we should be investing how we think we are investing or planning on investing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's all just, changing all the time and increasing. Great.
Everything is tied up in it, right? Like it goes in so many different directions. And, I think it's important for us to be talking about it and for us to be paying attention and to what's happening and like actually understanding the broader ramifications here. I would say more than anything, especially as we're going into this period where we're going to be discussing the future of hydro, the future of the province's economy, and obviously there are certain groups pushing data centers as being an alternative to the existing potential deal with Quebec. I think that we need to be paying attention to what is actually being put on the table here and whether that's a realistic proposal, because I'm very skeptical of it.
Eyes open.
Yeah,
eyes
absolutely.
open. All right, we'll leave it on eyes open today. Paris Marx, thank you so much.
Of course, always great to chat.
All right, folks, that is it for today's show. As always, any questions or thoughts for us, the signal at cbc.ca. Tomorrow is Giving Tuesday, a day labeled as the world's largest generosity movement. Founded in 2012, its goal is to establish an annual day dedicated to giving. We will speak with folks from Stella's Circle, a community organization that provides wraparound services rooted in social justice and inclusion to some of our community's most marginalized members. That's tomorrow. Don't miss it. Cheers.